It was one of those damp spring nights that clung to the windows like a memory. April 7th, 2017, a Friday. Rain came down in slow, steady sheets, muffling the world outside a modest two-story home in suburban New Jersey. Inside, 4 teenage girls were crammed onto a carpeted living room floor, their laughter echoing off the walls between bursts of whispered gossip, junk food wrappers, and half-finished sodas. They were close. Aubrey Klein, Hazel Romero, Kenzie Palmer, and Lila Durant had been inseparable since middle school, known in school halls as the Sleepover Squad, a nickname they both cringed at and secretly loved. They rotated whose house they stayed at. That night, it was Kenzie's. Her parents were downstairs watching a movie, occasionally checking in. Everything felt normal. By 9:30, phones were down, lights were dimmed, and the girls had settled into the real reason they loved these nights, their self-created tradition. Dead hide. A homemade twist on hide-and-seek in the dark mixed with horror dares. 1 seeker, 3 hiders, all lights off, no talking. The last girl found became the seeker for the next round. It was silly, harmless fun, and they'd played it dozens of times over the past 2 years. Kenzie's house was perfect for it. Narrow hallways, plenty of hiding spots, and just enough creaky floorboards to keep things spooky. At 10:38 p.m., Hazel checked her phone. She remembered the time because she had texted her mom a quick goodnight. The next round was starting. Aubrey volunteered to be the seeker this time. She was a little smaller than the others. With pale skin and straight chestnut hair, she always tucked behind both ears. Quiet, observant. The kind of kid who watched before speaking. Hazel, Lila, and Kenzie darted off to hide. Lila took the master bedroom closet, squeezing behind old coats. Kenzie crouched behind the laundry room door. Hazel went for the hall linen closet and wedged herself under a pile of blankets. The house fell into silence. They waited and waited. Then they heard it, the soft, uneven shuffle of someone moving down the hall. A long pause, then a sudden bang from the stairwell, followed by quick, quiet footsteps. Kenzie assumed Aubrey was trying to scare them. That was part of the fun. But no one came. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. Hazel whispered Kenzie's name from down the hall, breaking the silence. Something wasn't right. One by one, the girls emerged from their hiding spots, giggling nervously at first. Kenzie flipped on the light switch. They waited for Aubrey to laugh or shout, "Gotcha!" But the house stayed quiet. Her phone was still on the kitchen counter, buzzing softly with an unread group message. Her shoes were still by the front door. They checked every room, under beds, behind doors, even the back porch and basement. Kenzie knocked on the bathroom door, called Aubrey's name, and opened it slowly. Nothing. At first, they still believed it was part of the game. Maybe Aubrey had found the perfect hiding spot and was playing hard. But an hour passed, then another. By midnight, the tone in the room had changed. The girls had split up and searched the house more urgently. They opened kitchen cabinets, closets, and the shed out back. Nothing. Kenzie's mom came upstairs around 12:15 a.m., bleary-eyed and confused. The girls were crying, panic setting in. "We can't find her," Hazel kept repeating, voice shaking. "She was just here." The storm outside had picked up. Rain pounded the roof. Kenzie's parents checked every locked door. All were still secured from the inside, windows untouched. There were no signs of a break-in, no sound of anyone leaving. The front porch light still flickered from where it always shorted out during storms. At 12:42 a.m., Kenzie's mom called 911. The dispatcher logged it as a potential missing juvenile. Left during a sleepover. Low priority at first. Maybe she'd wandered off. Maybe she was hiding nearby. Maybe it was a prank. But Kenzie's mother insisted she never left the house. She couldn't have police arrived at 1:13 a.m. They began with a standard walkthrough, searched the yard, knocked on the neighbors' doors, found no signs of anyone matching Aubrey's description. By 3 a.m., the girls were huddled together on the living room couch, wrapped in blankets, silent, staring at the empty hallway like it might explain something. The game was over. Aubrey was gone, and none of them had heard a thing. At 8:06 a.m. the next morning, Aubrey Klein's mother pulled into the Palmer family's driveway. It was still raining, lighter now, a steady drizzle tapping across the windshield. She stayed in the car a moment longer than usual, texting "here" like she always did, expecting a reply within seconds. When none came, she shrugged it off. Probably still asleep. Normal for a sleepover night. But when she knocked at the door and Kenzie's mother answered, the look on her face wasn't tired. It was pale, shaken, eyes red. That's when Aubrey's mom knew something was wrong. Inside, the girls were all gathered in the living room, still in pajamas, blankets wrapped around them, faces frozen. Hazel was crying quietly. Lila kept staring at the hallway like she hadn't moved in hours. Kenzie's mother explained everything in fragments, the sleepover, the game, the hours they thought Aubrey was just hiding, how they searched, how they waited, how no one saw her leave. Aubrey's mom didn't believe it. She refused to. She walked through the house calling her daughter's name herself, first calmly, then louder, then screaming. She opened closets, kicked open the bathroom door, yanked back shower curtains, checked under the guest bed twice. She kept saying the same thing. She wouldn't just leave. By 8:27 a.m., someone called 911 for the second time. This time, the dispatcher escalated the case. Missing juvenile, possible abduction, not seen since approximately 10:45 p.m. last night. Officers from the Ridgeway Township Police Department arrived minutes later. They entered cautiously but quickly. The parents were separated and interviewed in the kitchen. The girls, still stunned, were brought into the dining room and asked to recount everything they remembered. Each girl gave a nearly identical version of the night: the pizza, the game, the rules. Aubrey went to seek. They hid. She never came to find them. Kenzie added that they thought she was joking at first. That's what scared her the most, how long they'd waited, still thinking it was part of the game. Officers walked the house from top to bottom. Nothing was broken, no open doors, no smashed windows. Every point of entry was intact. The basement had a padlock on the inside. The second-floor windows couldn't be opened more than 6 inches. There was no sign of blood, no sign of struggle. It was like Aubrey had simply vanished, but her belongings told a different story. Her phone, with a cracked pop socket and a wallpaper of her dog, Moose, was still on the kitchen counter. Her shoes, neatly placed by the door, hadn't been moved. Her overnight bag still zipped, except for her pajamas and toothbrush. Her inhaler, which she used almost daily, was found next to the couch, untouched. None of it made sense. By 9:40 a.m., the house was declared an active scene. Yellow tape went up. Officers began knocking on doors up and down the street. A neighbor 2 doors down said he'd heard kids laughing around 10 p.m. Then nothing. Another neighbor had been out late working a shift and didn't get home until after midnight. He saw no one. Detectives were called in before noon. They reviewed initial interviews and walked the layout of the house again. They were struck by how small the window was, no more than 20 minutes unaccounted for between when the girls last heard movement and when they started looking. An early theory emerged. Maybe Aubrey had run away. Teenage impulse, late-night emotions, something triggered her. But the evidence was pushed back. No backpack, no phone, no shoes, no way to contact anyone, no history of running off. Her relationship with her mom was close, even affectionate. She wasn't in trouble. There was no fight that night. A missing persons bulletin went out at 1:15 p.m. Her photo, wide brown eyes, a small dimple in her left cheek, hair parted down the middle, was distributed to state police and uploaded to the National Registry. Patrol cars were stationed around the neighborhood. Officers searched storm drains, trash bins, and backyards. The Palmer house was now considered the last confirmed location, and that made it the center of everything. Forensics arrived later that afternoon. Every surface was dusted, every doorknob swabbed. They cataloged fingerprints, footprints, even loose strands of hair from the carpet. A canine unit was brought in. The dogs picked up a faint scent trail upstairs, leading to the second-floor hallway, and then stopping cold. No trail outside, no scent beyond the walls. That detail stuck with one detective, though no one knew what to make of it yet. By 6 p.m., the media had caught on. Local news vans pulled up. Reporters asked if the family would speak. They didn't. Inside the house, Aubrey's mother sat on the edge of the couch her daughter had slept on just hours before. She kept staring at the floor where the inhaler had been found, a quiet, plastic reminder that whatever happened, it wasn't voluntary. She whispered, "She didn't run. She was taken. But taken how? And by whom, when the house was locked from the inside?" That was the question no one could answer. And as the rain started again that night, just a little harder than before, the front door remained sealed. The last place anyone saw Aubrey Cline. By sunrise on Sunday, April 9th, the small town of Ridgway, New Jersey was awake in a way it hadn't been in years. The search for 14-year-old Aubrey Cline moved from a single house to an entire neighborhood. Police widened the perimeter beyond the Palmer residence, sweeping driveways, fences, garages, and sheds. Officers taped off sections of the street. Yellow flyers were printed with her photo and physical description, posted to telephone poles and convenience store windows within hours. She was listed as missing and endangered. Community volunteers, neighbors, church groups, even classmates gathered at a local park to receive assignments. They were broken into small teams and directed into the woods behind the Palmer home, a dense patch of state-owned forest land that hadn't been maintained in decades. Helicopters circled above, drones hovered low over thickets. Cadaver dogs were deployed across 2 square miles. Nothing turned up, no torn clothing, no footprints, no signs of recent passage, not even trash disturbed. It was as if no one had moved through the brush at all. By noon, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had joined the case. Tips poured in, most of them vague, many of them useless. A woman said she saw someone matching Aubrey's description at a gas station off Route 17. Another claimed she might have been in a Walmart bathroom stall with a man who seemed off. Investigators followed up everyone. Surveillance footage at the gas station showed a girl in a red hoodie, but the timestamp put her there hours before Aubrey disappeared. Walmart security pulled the footage. The stall in question had been empty. The 3 girls who had been with her that night, Kenzie, Hazel, and Lila, were taken in separately to speak with child forensic interviewers. Each session lasted over an hour. Their stories were consistent to the minute. They all remembered Aubrey volunteering to be the seeker. They remembered the sound of footsteps. They remembered the moment they came out and started looking. None of them reported hearing a door open. No screams, no struggle, just silence. One of the officers noted how rehearsed it sounded, but child psychologists present during the interviews disagreed. The girls were showing classic signs of shock, not deception. They weren't covering for someone. They were trying to make sense of something senseless. Over the next 48 hours, the investigation ramped up. Ridgway PD worked alongside the New Jersey State Police, cross-checking every known sex offender in a 20-mile radius. 27 names came up. Officers visited each one in person. 4 didn't have alibis on file, but 2 were ruled out through GPS data from their ankle monitors. The other 2 had solid alibis confirmed by employment records and security footage. Truck logs from nearby rest stops were subpoenaed. Anyone who might have passed through the area that night was looked at. One driver's log had a 45-minute gap during the time Aubrey disappeared, but dashcam footage showed he'd pulled off the road for an emergency repair. The neighborhood itself was combed again. Officers went door to door, asking about unfamiliar vehicles, late-night noises, lights. No one reported anything suspicious. A retired couple 2 houses down remembered their dog barking sometime after 11 p.m., but that wasn't unusual. The only detail that caught an investigator's attention came from a neighbor across the street who remembered Palmer's porch light flickering on and off sometime that night. They thought it was a power surge. And it had been. On Monday, technicians confirmed a temporary outage occurred between 10:41 and 11:19 p.m., exactly when Aubrey had gone missing. The neighborhood had experienced a rolling transformer fault due to weather. That outage also impacted the Palmer house's security system. Their Wi-Fi router went down. The interior cameras, previously set to back up via cloud, were disabled. It left a window of 38 minutes unrecorded. That detail, power outage, camera failure, disappearance, felt too coincidental to investigators. But there was no evidence to tie it to an outside force, no indication anyone had tampered with the system. As days passed, the command post moved from the Palmer house to a nearby church. The FBI was looped in by midweek. Search grids were expanded to nearby lakes and drainage tunnels. Dive teams searched Stillwater Pond. Sonar was used. Nothing. In town, posters of Aubrey's face became part of the landscape. Grocery stores, gas stations, the post office. The expression on her missing flyer was frozen, neutral, almost hesitant. She wasn't smiling. That bothered her mother more than anything. By the end of the week, detectives were forced to consider the possibility no one had entered or exited the house that night, that Aubrey's disappearance hadn't started outside, but within the walls of the home itself. But if she never left, then where was she? And how could 4 people sleep under the same roof and never hear it happen? In the weeks that followed Aubrey Klein's disappearance, the town of Ridgway lost its sense of normal. The porch lights that once flickered lazily on quiet streets now stayed on overnight, motion sensors armed, back doors double-locked. Parents kept tighter grips on their kids, and the laughter of girls walking home from school seemed to soften, thinned by a sense that something had changed, maybe for good. The police presence faded slowly. First, the search parties scaled back. Then, the mobile command center at the church parking lot was packed up and hauled away. By June, the tip hotline was averaging only 1 call every few days, most from out-of-state psychics or well-meaning strangers who swore they'd seen a girl just like her in a grocery store or rest stop bathroom. Not one lead held up under scrutiny. Aubrey's mother, Dana, kept a notebook by the phone. Every caller, every message, every dead end scribbled in ink. She took to driving around the surrounding counties, stopping at libraries and shelters, just in case. She left flyers taped to vending machines, laundromats, and public bathroom stalls. At one point, she printed over 4,000 missing posters with her own money. She refused to change her number, afraid her daughter might one day try to call. By fall, the case had gone cold. Detectives quietly shifted focus to more active cases, but officially, the file remained open. Pending new evidence, the community moved on in cautious, uneven steps. But online, the case was just starting to spread. On Reddit, YouTube, and crime forums, theories began circulating. Some users were convinced it was a trafficking case, pointing to the brief power outage, the silence, the fact that her phone and shoes had been left behind. Others were convinced it was someone inside the house, a cousin, a sibling, a parent. One post gained traction suggesting the girls had made a suicide pact, and Aubrey had been the only one to follow through. Another hinted at a local cult, though there was no record of any group like that in Ridgway. The theories fed on each other. A podcast episode about Aubrey aired in December, and downloads spiked. Strangers dissected every known fact, combed old Instagram posts, and speculated about her body language and photos. Videos from school plays, birthday parties, and volleyball games were uploaded and analyzed. Some said she always seemed withdrawn, like she knew something. As attention grew, so did scrutiny on the Palmer family. Kenzie's parents were bombarded with emails and anonymous messages, accusing them of covering something up. Online trolls claimed the parents lawyered up too quickly, that they never cried on camera, that they moved out too soon. And they did move. Less than a year after the disappearance, the Palmer house was sold quietly, below market value. The family relocated out of state without notice. Neighbors said the pressure had become unbearable. At one point, someone had spray-painted LIARS across their garage door. Another night, a brick was thrown through their window. Kenzie, once Aubrey's best friend, closed all her social media accounts and didn't show up to her freshman year at Ridgway High. Hazel and Lila stayed in town, but barely spoke to each other. The 3 girls who had once been inseparable now barely acknowledged one another in the hallway. Rumors followed them. Some said Hazel had lied to police about hearing a sound that night. Others said Lila had confessed something to a counselor, but retracted it later. None of it was ever verified. One detective, Donald Reyes, refused to let the case die quietly. A 19-year veteran, Reyes had worked homicides and kidnappings across the state. Something about Aubrey's case stuck with him. The quiet, the absence of evidence. He returned to the house more than once after the family had left. He re-interviewed neighbors, pulled the girls' interviews again, and spent weeks mapping timelines against weather data and electrical outage records. Privately, Reyes began to suspect the disappearance didn't involve an outside perpetrator. He started to believe the answer might have always been inside the house, but he couldn't prove it. There were no fingerprints, no evidence of a break-in, no signs of a struggle. Nothing pointed to an abduction. Nothing ruled it out either. The theory of a planned runaway had long been dismissed, but Reyes still returned to it occasionally, hoping he'd missed something. If Aubrey had left willingly, why leave everything behind? If she'd been lured, by whom and when? The timeline left a sliver of space, but only if something had been orchestrated with precision. By the time the one-year anniversary arrived, a candlelight vigil was held at Stillwater Park. Fewer than 50 people came. Most stood in silence, staring down at the flickering tea lights placed in a loose circle. Dana sat in the front row, hands clasped, eyes fixed ahead. She didn't speak. What haunted people most wasn't just that Aubrey had vanished, but how. No struggle, no sound, no witnesses. She was just gone. A year later, that silence still lingered in the space where a scream should have been. 3 years after Aubrey Klein vanished without a trace, her name had faded from the news cycle. The town had moved on, at least outwardly. The house she disappeared from had been sold twice since the Palmer family left. The flyers were gone. The vigils had stopped. But in the Ridgeway Police Department's cold case division, her file still sat on a shelf, boxed, labeled, and mostly untouched since 2018. It might have stayed there indefinitely if not for a newly transferred investigator named Joseph Rayner. Rayner was in his early 50s, methodical, and by most accounts, obsessive. He'd worked missing persons cases in Newark for over a decade, including 2 recovery operations that gained national attention. When he transferred to Ridgeway, he asked for cold cases with physical access to the last known scene. Aubrey's case was the only one that fit that criteria. He started from the beginning: police statements, timelines, 911 logs, forensics, and floor plans. He read everything, twice. Then he requested access to the Palmer house, now owned by a retired couple who had no idea about its history. With their permission, Rayner spent 2 afternoons walking the layout. It was smaller than he expected: 3 bedrooms, 1 shared bathroom upstairs, 1 downstairs, a narrow hallway, low ceilings, creaky floors. Nothing remarkable, until he opened the original building plans. One line caught his eye: a notation for a non-standard wall cavity behind the upstairs bathroom, adjacent to a ventilation shaft. It was labeled as crawl space access, leading into an insulated attic. Rayner paused. The crawl space wasn't mentioned in any of the 2017 walkthrough reports. He combed the official floor diagram submitted to the Missing Persons Task Force. No mention there either. He started looking for references in field notes, specifically those from the initial search team that had cleared the attic. That's when he hit a snag. The report from the officer who had inspected the attic, Sergeant Mark Delaney, was missing from the digital archive. Rayner assumed it had been misfiled. When he contacted records, they found a scanned document, but it was incomplete. The final page, which would have included the attic clearance log, was never uploaded. The physical copy? Lost in a storage unit flood during a reorganization in 2020. Delaney, as it turned out, had died of a stroke in late 2018. He was 49 years old, a decorated officer, trusted. No one had reason to second-guess his work, until now. Rayner couldn't let it go. He visited the attic himself. Access was through a hatch in the upstairs hallway ceiling, reachable only with a stepladder. The current owners said they hadn't used it since moving in. Rayner climbed up alone. The space was cramped: low beams, dusty insulation, exposed wiring. He documented the area with his own notes and photos. No obvious signs of disturbance, just the usual: fiberglass dust, old wood, a few insulation panels that had fallen loose. But one thing stood out. On the far side, behind a beam near the ventilation duct, was a small section of drywall that didn't quite match the rest, slightly newer. The screws were different, silver, not black. When tapped, the wall had a denser sound to it, like something had been added behind it. It wasn't a definitive clue. It could have been part of a prior repair. But the inconsistency bothered him. Back at the station, Rayner pulled up the list of everyone who had accessed the attic in the initial search. Only one name was recorded: Delaney. No backup, no. Second verification: no video or photographic documentation. Just his signature on the clearance log, which was now missing. He made calls to the forensic team members still active from 2017. Most remembered the crawl space. A few vaguely recalled that Delaney had mentioned nothing up there but dust and squirrel droppings. No one questioned it. Resources had been stretched thin. There were more promising leads at the time. They'd all moved on. Rayner didn't. He built a timeline down to the minute, from the last text Aubrey sent to the moment the girls realized she was gone. He re-examined the outage window. 38 minutes, cameras down. The house is dark. No one hears a sound. If Aubrey had been moved, or moved herself, during that gap, where would she have gone? He marked every possible exit: front door, back door, basement, windows. None were used. No footprints, no fibers, no forced entry or exit. It always came back to the same impossible scenario. She vanished without leaving the house. Unless she never did. Unless someone had moved her without ever stepping outside. Unless the attic had been more than just insulation and dust. Rayner drafted a request to reopen forensic access to the attic. He wanted ground-penetrating radar, structural imaging, a second opinion, but he needed more than a hunch. He needed something provable. He returned to the house 2 days later with a stud finder and a thermal imaging camera borrowed from a colleague. The thermal scan came back mostly uniform, except for a small section behind the mismatched drywall. It was denser, colder, possibly hollow. Whatever was back there had been sealed, not just hidden, deliberately covered, and if someone had gone to the trouble of sealing it, there was a reason they didn't want anyone to look inside. In early February of 2025, a young couple named Mason and Dana Caldwell moved into a modest 2-story home on Ridgeway's east side. They were newly married, early 30s, first-time homeowners. The house had good bones, a quiet neighborhood, and enough space for the family they hoped to start. It had also been sitting on the market for over a year, priced low, with the seller eager to close. The listing agent offered no explanation, and the Caldwells didn't ask. By spring, they were deep into renovations, new paint, new flooring, pulling out old insulation in the attic. It was during those weeks, as temperatures warmed and the house settled around them, that Mason began noticing the sounds. At first, it was soft, a faint tapping above the master bedroom. Then it shifted, scratching, intermittent thumps, sometimes at night, sometimes mid-morning. It wasn't every day, just enough to be annoying. Mason assumed squirrels, maybe raccoons. He went up once with a flashlight and poked around. Aside from loose insulation and a few chewed wires, there wasn't much to see. But the sounds kept coming. By late April, Dinah started hearing. Them, too. One morning around 6 a.m., she swore she heard something that wasn't scratching, more like movement, slow, deliberate. They called a pest control company, and the technician confirmed some animal activity but didn't find a nest. Still, he sprayed the area, set traps, and recommended replacing the older insulation. That weekend, the Caldwells pulled down several panels near the back of the attic, near a vent shaft. As Dana peeled away a dense layer of fiberglass, something fluttered to the floor. Not an animal, but a small, square photograph. A Polaroid. She picked it up and froze. The photo was old, at least 10 years by the look of it, and slightly curled from heat and dust. It showed a teenage girl, maybe 13 or 14, crouched in a corner, lit by what looked like the beam of a flashlight. Her expression was frozen in terror, eyes wide, lips parted, her shoulders drawn in like she was bracing for something. Behind her, the framing of the wall looked eerily familiar. Exposed beams, the same insulation, the same junction box just above her head. Donna lowered the photo and looked around. She was standing in that exact spot. Mason didn't recognize the girl, but something about her face stuck with him, the kind of image that lives in the back of your mind whether you want it to or not. Dana searched online, trying keywords: missing girl, Ridgeway, attic photo. Within minutes, she found a Reddit thread about a local case from 2017. The post featured a flyer. The missing girl's name was Aubrey Klein. Dana stared at the photo, then back at the screen. It was the same girl. The hairstyle had changed. She looked younger in the poster, but the eyes were unmistakable. They called the police. Ridgeway PD responded quickly. The address triggered an alert in the dispatch system. Within hours, detectives arrived on site, along with a forensic team. The Caldwells were asked to leave the property temporarily. Officers sealed off the attic, established a perimeter, and requested backup from state investigators. The Polaroid was bagged and documented. Preliminary analysis dated it to within the last decade. The film type and degradation pattern were consistent with a photo taken between 2015 and 2018. The image wasn't staged. It wasn't fake. The girl in the photograph had been in that attic. That night, police conducted a second scan of the crawl space using updated equipment. Structural sensors showed a hollow section behind the northeast insulation wall, a cavity roughly 3 feet wide and 7 feet long, boxed in behind a layer of drywall that didn't appear in any architectural plans. The following morning, with a warrant secured, investigators began carefully removing the wall. Beneath the insulation, behind aged plywood and a panel of nailed drywall, they found a sealed void. It was dark, stale, quiet. Inside, they found a single stained blanket, a crushed plastic water bottle, a rusted flashlight with dead batteries, and bone fragments. The cavity was shallow, too shallow for an adult to lie down fully. It had no ventilation, no way in or out except through the hatch they'd just opened. Dental records would later confirm what they already suspected. The remains belonged to Aubrey Klein. Her final hiding place had been inches above the heads of the people searching for her. 8 years, and she had never left the house. The wall came down in slow, cautious pieces. Investigators wore respirators and headlamps, stepping carefully across joists to avoid disturbing the scene more than necessary. Dust hung in the air, thick with insulation fibers and time. Behind the last layer of drywall was a hidden cavity, a false enclosure, boxed in deliberately with fresh framing, newer than the rest of the attic structure. No entrance, no latch, just sealed boards, nailed from the outside. Inside, the space was smaller than anyone expected, barely 3 feet wide, less than 7 feet long. No light source, no airflow. One thin, stained blanket lay crumpled in the corner, matted against decayed floorboards. Beside it were fragments of a plastic wrapper, faded branding from a snack discontinued in 2018, and a flashlight with corroded batteries. The air was heavy, stale, undisturbed. Then they saw the bones, mostly intact, though partially fragmented by time and pressure. Human remains, small, juvenile. A forensic pathologist arrived that evening. Initial analysis confirmed the body had belonged to a female between the ages of 13 and 15. The remains had been there for years. Investigators found no clothing, no shoes, no ID. Only what was left of her spine, skull, and limbs, curled in on themselves like she'd never been able to stretch out. The walls surrounding the cavity weren't just bare, they were covered. Dozens of vertical scratches lined one panel, finger-length, uneven, deep. Some were frantic, carved into the wood with fingernails or some blunt object. Others looked almost methodical, tallies, counting something. Higher on the wall, pressed between two beams, were words scratched shallowly into the drywall. A child's handwriting, shaky, uneven. A dozen separate phrases etched in with what looked like a broken nail or a piece of plastic. I hear them laughing. He said, "Don't scream. It's not the game anymore. Mom, please. Over and over again, please. On the beam directly above where the blanket lay was the last phrase, slightly clearer than the rest, carved into the wood with deeper intent. I'm still here. By the end of the week, dental records confirmed what investigators already knew. The remains belonged to Aubrey Klein. She had never left the Palmer house, not that night, not ever. Her mother, Dana, was contacted personally by lead detective Joseph Rayner. She didn't ask how her daughter died. She only asked one question. Was it fast? But it hadn't been. The forensic report estimated the time of death occurred between 7 and 14 days after her disappearance, likely due to dehydration. There were no signs of blunt force trauma, no broken bones, no restraints. Aubrey had been left in that space, alive, alone, hidden so well that search teams, cadaver dogs, and forensic units all missed her. The chilling part was the proximity. The hidden cavity was only inches from the hallway. At any given time, there were people directly beneath her, talking, calling her name. She had been within arm's reach of safety, and no one had known. Detectives reconstructed the construction of the false wall. It wasn't part of the original design. No permits were pulled, no renovations logged. The framing nails were non-standard, traced back to a local hardware store. Surveillance footage from 2017 no longer existed. There was no way to know who had bought them, but someone had. Someone had built that wall, and someone had put her there. The phrasing on the wall, particularly, "He said don't scream," shifted the investigation sharply. This wasn't a case of a child hiding and getting stuck. This was deliberate, controlled, predatory. The fact that she'd written it all, that she had time and awareness to document her experience, meant she wasn't unconscious. She was lucid. She was scared. She heard what was happening outside. She knew people were nearby. And yet, she stayed quiet. Maybe she was warned. Maybe she was threatened. But whatever it was, she obeyed. Investigators began quietly cross-referencing everyone who had been inside the house in the days before and after her disappearance. That list included the Palmer family, their relatives, friends, maintenance workers, responding officers, and neighbors. But the person who built that wall likely did so in advance or within hours of her going missing, and did it without drawing attention. Only a small handful of people had that kind of access. What haunted Rayner most was the timing. Aubrey was likely alive for the first week of the search, possibly two. She may have heard her name called through the vents. She may have screamed and no one heard, or maybe she never did. He stared at the final words carved into the beam, "I'm still here," and thought about how many times people had walked under that attic, searching, calling, missing her by foot. Now the question has changed. It wasn't just who put her there. It was why no one had looked harder. The forensic timeline puts everything into a painful perspective. Aubrey Klein had been alive for up to 14 days after the night she disappeared. The cause of death was officially listed as dehydration, but the underlying truth was more disturbing. She had died slowly, in the dark, sealed inside a space she could never escape. There were no signs of restraint, no blunt trauma, no defensive wounds. But the marks on the walls, the scratches, the writing, those were her fight. And they made one thing heartbreakingly clear. She hadn't been unconscious. She hadn't been unaware. She'd known she was trapped. The crime scene reconstruction revealed that the false wall had been built from the inside out, reinforced with framing wood and drywall not found elsewhere in the house. It wasn't a spontaneous act. It took planning, access, and enough time to work unnoticed. The attic was directly accessible only through the upstairs hallway, which meant the person responsible had moved freely through the house during a sleepover, with other children downstairs. Detectives turned their attention back to the list of individuals who'd had physical access to the Palmer home during the 24-hour window surrounding Aubrey's disappearance. In total, 11 names emerged: the Palmer parents, the 3 girls, 2 neighbors who had stopped by earlier that day, and 4 first responders. Most were cleared quickly, but one name stood out: not because of any prior suspicion, but because of how little attention had been paid to him in the original investigation. Ethan Palmer, 17 years old at the time, the host family's oldest son. He hadn't been home the night of the disappearance, or so the report said. He had told police he'd been staying at a friend's house. The alibi was never confirmed beyond a text message, one that investigators now realized had been accepted at face value. There had been no follow-up, no digital analysis, no location data retrieved from his phone. When investigators dug deeper, they found that Ethan had a history of behavioral issues dating back to middle school, detentions for bullying, an expulsion threat for harassment, a written complaint from a teacher about predatory fixation on female classmates. Nothing had ever escalated to a criminal charge. He was smart, quiet, withdrawn in public, but controlling in private, especially at home. One statement from a former girlfriend described him as intense, saying he'd sometimes speak in hypotheticals about hiding places no one would ever think to look. She'd never reported it, just brushed it off as weird talk from a moody teenager. Back in 2017, Ethan had been interviewed briefly after Aubrey went missing. He said he didn't know her well, said he left before the girls started their game, that he was at Nate Gleason's house from 9:30 p.m. onward. But Nate moved away in 2019, and by 2025, his contact information was out of date. It took weeks to locate him. When they did, Nate hesitated. Eventually, he admitted he hadn't seen Ethan that night until well after midnight. He'd arrived hours later than claimed, and when he did, he said nothing about why. That discrepancy reopened the investigation. Search warrants were issued for Ethan's digital history, phone backups, email accounts, old devices recovered from storage, a forensic image of an external hard drive. Drive yielded encrypted folders. Inside were dozens of files, many deleted and partially recovered, detailing a disturbing array of writings, stories, journals, fictional scenarios, he called them. One folder stood out. It was named Observer. Inside were entries written from a first-person perspective, describing movements around the house during the sleepover. They were vague, but certain phrases matched known facts. The power went out. The hallway stayed dark. Someone watching through a vent. One entry read, "She didn't scream. She just sat there, waiting for someone to open the wall." Another said, "They were laughing downstairs, and she thought they'd hear her." But they didn't. No one ever does. Ethan had moved to a remote part of Maine in 2021, changed his name legally after turning 21, and had kept a low profile ever since. But he'd never deleted everything. Pieces of the truth still lived in metadata, buried in archive files he didn't think anyone would ever dig deep enough to find. By July of 2025, Ridgway PD issued a warrant for his arrest, but Ethan Palmer was already gone. Neighbors reported he had abruptly left town 2 days earlier. His apartment had been emptied overnight. No forwarding address, no credit card activity, no digital footprint. It was like he'd vanished. The investigation had cracked open a long-buried truth. Someone in the house had built that wall, someone who knew Aubrey was upstairs, and someone who had returned quietly after the lights were off, after the girls had hidden and placed her inside. Not a stranger, not a kidnapper. The monster hadn't come from outside. He'd been living upstairs. When the forensic and digital evidence began pointing to Ethan Palmer, investigators circled back to the 3 girls who had been in the house that night: Hazel Romero, Kenzie Palmer, and Lila Durant. All of them were now in their early 20s, living separate lives scattered across different states. None of them had remained close. Whatever bond they once shared had splintered under the weight of unanswered questions, public suspicion, and private guilt. Detectives contacted them individually, requesting new interviews under the reopened case. Hazel agreed first. She met with investigators in a quiet room inside a police annex building, her hands trembling as she scrolled through old photos of Aubrey on a cracked phone screen. For years, she'd buried everything, told herself it wasn't her fault, that they had all done what they could. But now, she admitted something she hadn't said back then. She remembered how Aubrey had told her on more than one occasion that she didn't like being at Kenzie's house, not because of Kenzie, because of Ethan. He made her uncomfortable. He stared. One time he followed her halfway home from school without saying a word. She thought maybe she was imagining it, but Hazel had seen it too. From across the street, the way... Ethan stood near the mailbox when Aubrey walked up the driveway, pretending to scroll his phone but never looking away. Back then, none of them knew what to do with that kind of discomfort. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't physical. It was just quiet, subtle, dismissible. And they did what most teenagers do when something feels off. They ignored it until it disappeared. But the hardest part, Hazel said, was what happened the night Aubrey vanished. Around 10:50 p.m., not long after the lights had been turned off for their game, she'd been hiding in the hallway closet. From that spot, she could see the thin gap beneath Ethan's bedroom door, a faint strip of light always visible when he was home. That night, the light was off, until it wasn't. She saw it flicker on for just a moment. I heard a soft creak, like the door opening. And then, footsteps. Not loud. Just slow movement down the hallway. She froze, didn't move, didn't speak. She told herself it was one of the girls, but it wasn't. And she never told anyone. Out of fear, out of guilt, out of uncertainty. Lila was next. She was reluctant, defensive at first. But when shown the digital entries recovered from Ethan's hard drive, the fictionalized journals, the stories written in a voice too close to real, her demeanor cracked. She said she'd never seen those files before, but the tone sounded familiar. She remembered once borrowing Ethan's laptop to type a school paper and finding a document she wasn't meant to see. It was password protected, labeled Observer Log. She never opened it. She told herself it was nothing. Kenzie was the last to speak. Sitting across from detectives, she looked hollowed out by something heavier than time. When they asked about her brother, she didn't defend him. She didn't say it wasn't possible. She didn't say he wasn't capable. She said, "I always thought he hated her." She recalled tension between Ethan and Aubrey. Little things, cold remarks, a slammed door, the way he'd sometimes linger in the hallway when Aubrey was over. One time, Kenzie said, she caught him watching their game from the top of the stairs, expressionless, silent. She had told him to go back to his room. He didn't answer. He just turned and walked away. When Ethan was finally located in a rented cabin outside of Dover Foxcroft, Maine, U.S. Marshals made the arrest without incident. Inside the cabin were hard drives, notebooks, and hand-drawn floor plans, some of which included the layout of other homes pulled from public real estate listings. One drawing had a mark labeled Hidden Access, another, Best Line of Sight. On his social media, most of it locked behind aliases, were hundreds of bookmarked posts and forums dedicated to surveillance, control, and domination fantasies. He followed threads about perfect crimes and psychological submission. He'd commented under false names, offering suggestions on how to isolate victims, how to control a space without ever being seen. One username matched a login used to post in an obscure thread from 2019 that discussed the Aubrey Klein case. The post was short, just one sentence. They looked everywhere except up. Ethan never confessed, never gave a statement. During transport, he stared out the window and said nothing. But what investigators had now was more than enough. Not just a theory, not just a story. Proof, a name, a person who knew the house from inside, who had the means, the time, the motive, and the silence. But what haunted everyone most was the timeline, the journals, the drawings, the files. Because if what he'd written was true, if he had done this before in fantasy, then Aubrey might not have been the first girl he watched, just the first he acted on. During the second sweep of the crawl space, tucked between the insulation and a fractured beam, investigators found something no one expected to recover. A cloth-bound notebook, small and frayed at the edges, warped slightly from heat and time. It was partially hidden beneath the corner of the stained blanket. The front cover had no name, no date, just a sticker, peeling and worn, a smiling cartoon fox. When the forensics team opened it, they found writing. Pencil, shaky but legible. Page after page of uneven lines, broken sentences, fragments of thought. It was Aubrey's. She had brought it with her that night, part of the overnight bag found untouched by the front door. Somehow, when she was taken, or lured, into that hidden cavity, she'd managed to keep it. She had written in near total darkness, pressing hard enough into the paper that the indentations left shadows beneath the strokes. The first entry was dated April 7th, 2017, the night she disappeared. I'm in the attic, I think. I can't tell how long. I don't know what time it is. The next few pages were disjointed, descriptions of sounds, light footsteps outside the wall, voices, sometimes girls laughing, sometimes quiet breathing. She mentioned being too afraid to scream, afraid he'd hear. I can hear them. They don't know I'm here. On the fourth page, she wrote about trying to find a way out, scraping at the corners, pushing her hands against the drywall until her knuckles bled. She described a small beam of light through a sliver in the wall that vanished after the second day. She thought someone had covered the gap on purpose. I heard him say, "Don't be loud. I think he's close. I don't know why he picked me." Later entries shifted in tone, less linear, more scattered. She stopped dating the pages. She circled words, repeated names. Mom appeared again and again, written larger, darker each time. Please. I don't think they're coming. I don't think they know I'm here. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet, he'd let me go. Some of the entries were hard to read. The pencil had dulled. Her grip must have weakened, but what was legible painted a slow unraveling. Hunger, fear, loneliness. She described hearing people searching, barking dogs, a man shouting her name. She tried to respond once, whispered, knocked, but nothing happened. I think I'm under them. I think I'm right below the hallway. I can hear the stairs. She began counting time by sound, daylight when birds sang, night when the pipes clicked. But by the end, even that had stopped. The final entry was shorter than the rest. It's getting hard to breathe. The notebook was bagged as evidence, preserved, scanned, archived. It became the emotional core of the case, a direct account of what she endured, of how long she waited, of how close she had been. When her mother, Dana, was allowed to read it, she asked for only one copy. She didn't read it all at once. She couldn't, but she kept it by her bed. Sometimes she would open to a random page and just sit in silence, imagining her daughter's voice in the dark. The attic was sealed and preserved as a forensic archive. The house, once again, went on the market. A private buyer purchased it anonymously. Some believe it was Dana, others say it was the state, but no one has lived there since. Every year on April 7th, someone leaves a single battery-operated lantern at the edge of the driveway, always turned on, always pointed upward. Neighbors say they've seen Dana there once or twice. She never stays long, just stands near the garage, holding something, watching the attic window like it still holds something she can reach. No charges were ever filed beyond Ethan Palmer's arrest. He refused to speak, refused to acknowledge the diary, but the words inside left no doubt. Aubrey had been alone, trapped, silenced, but she'd found a way to speak anyway. In the end, it wasn't a camera, a confession, or a mistake that revealed the truth. It was her voice, pressed in pencil, into dust,